Okay, this is super exciting. So I wanted to make a quick video about the impact that the trucker protests are having on what is happening in Canada. For those of you who don't know, Canada has had these super draconian mandates for the past 2 years with very little to no opposition to Trudeau's crazy mandates. And this has been pretty much across every political spectrum. You're talking all the way from conservative to liberal. Nobody was really challenging these mandates. But it was after they came after the truckers that the truckers stood up and said, no, enough is enough with these mandates. So thus, we see the trucker protests that are happening now. And we're seeing that this is actually giving a lot of courage to the people that are in Congress, in their parliament in Canada. So I wanted to share some of those videos with you of some of the speeches that are happening in the Canadian Parliament. These members of Parliament are now finally speaking up and finding their voice of opposition to Trudeau's fascism, is what I would call it. I mean, if you see what's happening in Canada, it's unbelievable. I mean, they are arresting pastors for daring to have service, church service. But meanwhile, Walmart can stay open. All these big corporations, they're allowed to operate. But small mom and pop stores, churches, they arrest pastors. So let's just watch what's going on in the parliament.
Show up at protests and take a knee, but hide from 100,000 truckers and citizens who are rallying for democracy. We call for reconciliation with Indigenous communities and an end to protesting, but fail to realize that we too can extend a simple olive branch.
Vaccine mandates, calling them. A year ago, the Prime Minister rejected vaccine mandates, calling them extreme measures that could have real divisive impacts on our community and country. Since then, no one has created more division than the Prime Minister, pitting Canadian against Canadian and using vaccine status as a dangerous political weapon. In the words of a senior Liberal today, now that we have one of the most vaccinated populations in the world, we've never been so divided. When will the Prime Minister stop dividing Canadians and end his punitive vaccine mandates?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et j'apprécie particulièrement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do appreciate these remarks about vaccine status. When I get vaccinated, I do it for myself, but not just for myself. I do it for my parents as well, for example. When I go visit my parents, knowing that I'm vaccinated, I know I'm protecting them. When my son gets vaccinated, I know he's protected, and I'm happy about it. And I also know that he's protecting everyone around him. So it's not just a very important personal decision that we take when we have the right vaccine status. It also means we are reaching out to protect those around us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is double vaccinated, had his booster, and just contracted COVID-19. So using mandates to discriminate against Canadians based on their vaccine status is absolutely punitive and discriminatory. A senior Liberal called on the Prime Minister to stop dividing Canadians on the issue of vaccine status. When will the Prime Minister start listening to the science, start listening to public health officials, start listening to his own members of Parliament, and end his campaign of discrimination and division against Canadians?
Other governments around the world step up with lower vaccination rates and say, look, we hear you, you've been traumatized, we're moving forward. But we are seeing other governments around the world step up with lower vaccination rates and say, look, we hear you, you've been traumatized, we're moving forward. Here's the deadline. This is the plan. No more mandates, no more masks, no more distancing. You can travel, you can live your life, you can hug each other again. Here's the date. This is the plan. Here's the thresholds. None of that in Canada. Absolutely none of that from the Prime Minister. People have been traumatized and they're mobilizing because they need some hope. They need somebody in this house of privilege to come down from our ivory towers and say, okay, little people, we hear you. So sorry we've traumatized you for 2 years. We're going to step up and we're going to give you some hope. Here's a deadline. The member opposite is laughing. The people in this house are incredibly privileged. That member has kept his job. Thousands of Canadians have lost their job. And he's laughing about his own privilege. What has he done to serve members that are marginalized, during this pandemic in his community, Mr. Speaker, but laugh at them in this House of Commons. Shame.
Rather demonstrations we've seen in Ottawa, in Quebec City, and all across the country, I will abstain from the kind of generalizations that we've heard these last few days. I've seen on Radio-Canada an interview with what seemed to be a very kind grandmother who demonstrated for her grandkids. She looked and sounded nothing like a white supremacist, nor did the Black, Sikh, and Indigenous Canadians I saw demonstrating on my way to Parliament these last 2 weeks, or in Quebec City this last Saturday. I have enough respect for my fellow Canadians not to engage in these easy and absurd labels.